Okay. And welcome back to The Common Historian, where history meets the supernatural. I'm Jeremy, and each week we explore the haunting intersections between our past and the paranormal. Tonight, I'm joined by Dennis W. Carroll, a paranormal investigator with over 55 years of experience to uncover the dark secrets of Charleston, South Carolina, where pirates, dungeons, and mass executions have created one of America's most haunted cities. So grab your favorite beverage, dim the lights, and prepare to journey into the world where history refuses to stay buried. Welcome, Dennis. I hope everything's going great for you tonight.
Yeah, doing okay. We're kind of in the middle of the polar vortex down here today, so it's been
Oh,
kind of dippy. Good day to stay inside and drink hot chocolate.
oh yes. We're getting dumped on by snow where I am in New York. So it's
Mhm.
winter is here. During your 55 years of investigating the paranormal, what drew you to Charleston's haunted history?
Well, I've often made the statement that if you're investigating, especially you're investigating hauntings, and this goes with cryptozoology as well, whatever you're investigating, you need to know its origin. You need to know its history and why it started or why it's doing what it's doing or whatever the situation is, the who, what, when, where, why, and how kind of thing. And it definitely ties in with history. And I'm a history buff. I've always loved history, but I like the history that you never hear about that much. The background history on things that they don't talk about in the books. I remember being very bored in history class at school because you hear the same old thing over and over. I wanted to find out what was really going on in the background and a lot of that stuff. And when it comes to hauntings and stuff like that, you've got to know your history. That's the key to every investigation, usually lies in the history. It will tell you a lot of things of what went on, what to look for, how you understand it, how you approach what it is you're investigating. As an ex cop myself, I was taught many, many years ago the investigative techniques, what the professionals do to investigate. And when I go into a situation like that, Jeremy, I look upon it as a crime scene in a way. You want it to talk to you and tell you what its history is, what happened, what went on here. In order to understand that, you have to get deeper into the history of the place, especially if it's a historical type, haunting type place, situation going on. You definitely, and I have investigated a lot of old historical sites and like that over the years. And one of the most interesting ones that I investigated was the old Charleston jail, which that thing looks like it's definitely something out of a horror movie. I mean, it looks like Council Dracula on a bad day. Okay, it is a very bad looking place. And when I first rolled up there and looked down, I said, "If this is not haunted, there's no way. This can't be haunted." Okay, but it has a lot of history to it. When it was first built, I think it was in the very early 1800s, late 1700s, when it was first actually built. I think there have been several institutions there over the years. It was surrounded by swamp on one side, swamps, and on the other side was the ocean, and then town was on one side. So if you escaped from there, you really didn't have much of a good place to go to. A lot of people supposedly perished in the swamp out there. And I'm going to tell you in a few minutes about an area close to it, which is where they hung the pirates. They would throw their bodies in the swamp when they would take them down. They would leave their bodies hanging up for a while for the other pirates to see, hey, this is what's going to happen to you if you show up here, And they would actually take the bodies down and throw them in the swamp for the gators. And I'm saying, I told somebody about that. I said, when I heard that, I said, well, if you want ghosts, that's how you get ghosts. You do that kind of thing. You're definitely going to have something going on. That place was very interesting. It has a historical thing about it was the fact that it actually was where they held prisoner the first female mass killer in this country. Her name was Lavinia Fisher. You may have heard of her. She was
Yes.
a very evil lady. Her and I think her husband unallowed a lot of people as their in. And they called them finally. I think finally they caught up with them. And back in the day, and I think this was like in the early 1800s, somewhere like that, a woman could claim to be pregnant would usually get out of the punishment or the execution of something. And she claimed that, I think, a couple of times, but they found out she wasn't. She finally ran out of excuses and they hung her. And they hung her at the gallows, which was at the back of the jail, which is where I definitely went. Oh, yeah, that's the traumatic place to go. That's where I wanted to be. And actually, I have a brick from that courtyard here somewhere. It's not in the house, actually. I live outside, but one of the actual bricks from there that somebody gave me where they had the gallows at, which is not really, I don't think, a good thing to have as a paperweight in your house. I wouldn't advise it. But anyway, she was a very, shall we say, very interesting character in many ways. And her last words were, if anybody's got anything they want me to tell the devil, tell me now because I'm about to go see him. And that was supposed to be her last words. But they said her ghost had been seen, and inside the jail was a very, very long circular stairwell, a metal stairwell. I know you've seen those in a lot of reels and stuff. And her ghost supposed to be seen descending these stairs, so she was going out to the gallows. And while I was standing there talking to the curator of the place, I think it's now going to be finally turned into a museum, which you should have been done a long time ago. But I was standing there talking to the curator, and I had my hand on that stairwell, we were on the bottom floor. And if you've ever been around things like that, they're not real sturdy, especially metal stairwells like that, circular ones. And I've been up and down a few of them in my time. And I'm sitting there and I got my hand on, and I feel something, vibration, like someone walking down those steps, walking down the stairs. And I looked up. I didn't say anything. I just kind of looked up. Is that somebody coming down the stairs, Because there wasn't supposed to be anybody upstairs. And I look, and I'm standing there looking, and the curator says, you feel that, do you? I said, yes. He said, that's her probably coming down the stairs. A lot of other people have experienced this. I said, that's freaky, that I could feel this. And as we were standing there, and this was on a day in July, and it gets pretty warm in July around here, definitely down in Charleston. You're next to the ocean, you're in the tropics to a certain extent. And while we're standing there, and he said that to me, about that moment, there's like a breeze of cold air coming down through there. And I said, are there any windows open up there? What's going on? How did that do that? It's not got any central air or anything here. And he said, no, there's nothing open in this building. And I said, well, maybe it's just the vibration of automobiles on the street that's doing this. He said, no, this is like 3 foot of concrete you're standing on here. Only an earthquake would move this building, And so that was something that impromptu that happens very quickly while you were standing there. But that's the nature of the paranormal, Jeremy. And I tell people a lot like that, they say a lot of people come over, where's your evidence? You should have accumulated a lot over the years. You'll have things that I do. I've had recordings and photos and stuff. But here's the problem with the paranormal. It doesn't perform for you when you want it to. If I could do that, I told some ass woman, asked me that. I said, if I could do that, I'd be very rich, probably, because I would have a lot of very interesting evidence for you, but it will not perform for you on cue. Definitely not, unfortunately. So that's the number one thing when it comes to the paranormal you can expect is the unexpected. That's the way that goes. It always is. Having investigated a lot of these areas over all these many years that I've been involved in, I became years ago a doctor of metaphysics, a doctor of theology, philosophy, and some other things like that. To see the different angles and the way that things hold together, especially when it comes to metaphysics. Metaphysics is nothing but the study of the unseen and how it affects the seen properties of this universe. And my own history, when I began many, many years ago, I began at the very young age of about 14 when I had my very first actual in-your-face experience. I've always been, a monster kid from the old days with the monster movie. I always watched those. I was always interested in the supernatural. I like ghost stories and all that. But until you actually experience something for yourself, when that happens, it changes your whole perspective on things, And when I had that experience when I was 14, where I actually saw 3 demonic spirits leave a man and go through the wall next to him. And I'm like, jaw-dropping moment, did I see that? And it affected me very profoundly. I tried for a while. I mean, you see something like that, it's hard for your mind to comprehend things. And I kind of wanted to write it off as saying, oh, I must have imagined that. But finally, I had to be honest with myself and say, yeah, I did experience what I did. And when that happened, I said, well, now I've got to find out why, what it was, why, what caused this. So that kind of lit the fire under me to investigate and figure out what else was in this world. Because that is one thing, Jeremy, that has haunted me in my entire life. That one question, and I have run into many different, I guess you would call them supernatural entities over the years.
Yeah.
If this one thing is real, what else is out there? And that's what my career has been, looking for what else is out there. And to me, it's all of this, and I've had people ask me this before. What's the connection? They're all this is connected. And here's the answer. We are the connection. We are the connection to it. One of the connections, definitely one of the main connections. And I think, whether people realize it or not, the unknown, the supernatural, all of this is part of the very existence that we're in. Although science tends to ignore this stuff, it doesn't fit in their books. It doesn't fit in their experiments. If they can't see it and hold it, they tend to dismiss it. That's science, unfortunately. And real true science should not be like that. You should be questioning. You should be looking for things. You should be having an open mind. I believe in an open mind. Of course, you don't want to have it so open that your brain falls out. You need to have an open mind. If you close yourself off, you close yourself to a lot of. I have a quote, my own quote that I've said over the years. I believe in the possibility of the impossible because I believe in the possibility of possibilities. That anything can happen, And I've seen a lot of things like that. I have seen UFOs. I have come face to face with Bigfoot. I know he exists. I know he's real. I have seen what was possibly Dogman or a werewolf. I have seen these things. I have encountered the demonic face to face. I have seen apparitions. I saw a full bodied apparition once. I've seen different things over the years. And when you experience these things, it really comes down to that old saying that's very true, but seeing truly is believing.
Yeah.
It's one thing you can talk about it, you can read books about it, and you can have shows about it and all that. But when you see these things, that's when it really comes home to you that, yeah, this stuff is real. It's not made up. I'm writing the next book I'm working on right now. It's called Paracryptidology, Hunting Monsters and Things of Nightmare. And on the back, I've got a picture of a little boy watching TV. And this is what it says. When you're a child, you believe that monsters are real. Then you grow up to find out they really are. And that's been my story.
I know you talked about the old city jail. What kind of spiritual energy accumulates in there with such suffering and violence that has happened there?
Well, actually, I think anywhere there's trauma, a lot of high emotion. Some of the most haunted places I've been. I worked in a hospital one time for many years, and that was one of the most haunted locations I've ever been in. I can tell you a lot of ghost stories that came out of that. I even investigated a haunted ambulance one time that was not haunted by an actual person that died in the ambulance, but by someone that worked on the ambulance, was a paramedic. But any places of intense pain, trauma, death, and what could be more traumatic than death, okay? When you think about it, any place like that is open to these things. I think some places retain a memory sometimes. And you don't know what you're dealing with is actually a residual type haunting or is it an actual haunting going on? I think residual haunting is more like a time warp thing. You kind of looking back in time and seeing a certain event that happened being repeated over and over and over again. A residual haunting, they do not know you're there. They don't acknowledge you being there. That is definitely residual. And that's more or less like a time slip kind of a thing to me. But then you have hauntings that don't fall in that category. They have interaction with these things. A lot, and most of the time, it's been my experience over the years. I hate to disappoint people with this, and I have a lot of people argue with me about the statement I'm about to make. But 90% of spiritual activity that you run into is usually demonic in origin. There is very few that I would tag as actual human spiritual type activity. And I have seen evidence. This is kind of freaky. It's going to freak you out when you think about it. I've actually seen evidence that if perhaps you are a person who dies demonically possessed, that the demonic can hold you back in death. You still remain something like a prisoner for them. Now, I'm not saying that happens a lot. That's kind of rare, but it has, I think, happened to a certain extent. So I don't think that when you and I were to die under certain circumstances, we're going to hang around that long unless we got a very valid reason to
Do so, yeah.
Yeah, that's the way hauntings go to a certain extent. But most of the time that people run into these things, and most paranormal investigators will know this is to be true, a true fact. It is demonic, and they will try to fool you into believing that they're actual human ghosts. You don't fall for that because they're real tricky that way. They're trying to lead you astray, trying to give you false information. Most of the time, they get their jollies that way. They think that's funny to them. They think that's something they engage in to do. But most of the time, you're being led down the wrong path that way. You have to be very careful when you deal with spirits and all that, which is very true about testing them to see what kind of spirits you're dealing with, what's going on. And that's where history comes in to be very important. Because if you don't know what the connection with history is to it, you won't get the full picture of what you need to know. I'll give you a quick illustration. I was investigating a place one time with a so called psychic. And I'm not saying there are not some people out there that do not have psychic powers, but you got to be very careful in being selective with some of these people because some of them are not on the up and up here. Okay, I'll put it that way.
Yeah.
And this lady said, "Oh, she was in this house, and she said, I feel the spirit of a young girl here. She's about 13 years old, and she was murdered here or something, and this was 50 years ago and all that." So I thought that's very interesting, and so I already looked up the history of this house, this
Yeah.
place. I said, "Well, there is no record here of a 13-year-old child dying here. There was a 5-year-old child that died of whooping cough or something like that, smallpox or something. But there's no murders here. There's no that. So where did you get this information at? Where did you get this at? I looked in the records. I looked in the history. Where do you get that at?" And she said, "Well, my spirit guides told me that." I said, "Oh, really? That's interesting. Who is your spirit guide?" And she said, "Well, it's my spirit guide." I said, "Well, who told you that?" She said, "Well, my spirit guide told me that." So, "Oh, okay. I see where we're going here with this." I mean, anything could have told you that. When you contact the other side, my friend,
Yeah.
any of you out there, you got to remember this. When you open the door and you contact the other side, you do not know what you're actually dealing with over there. Okay. And you got to be extremely careful how you deal with that because there can be some very bad juju out there waiting on you. Okay. Never know. And you got to proceed with extreme caution on these things to really get the true picture of what's really going on here. But we need to look at history. That's where history is so important with that. And you got to find out what happened there, who was involved, whatever the situation. I even do that with just what I call private homes investigation. You got to find out. There's been many times that I have run into certain cases where something bad's going on there because the neighbors are doing something bad
Oh,
and it's bleeding over. That happened. There have been things. I had a woman call me not long ago, and she had seen me on television or something, and said, "Dr. Carroll, I just bought this house, and I wanted to ask your advice about something." And I said, "Sure, well, did." She said, "Well, we're walking through the house, and there's one room upstairs that is painted completely black."
no.
I said, "What you mean black?" She said, "Well, the whole room, the ceilings, the walls, the windows, everything, the floor is black." I said, "Well, that does not sound good."
No, that,
What kind of flooring you got here? And she said, "Well, there's carpet, black carpet on the floor." I said, "Well, can you pull that carpet up and see what's under it and call me back?" 2 hours later, she called me back and said, "Well, how did you know what was under that carpet?" I said, "I didn't. It was a guess." "Okay, what was it?" She said, "Well, there's like a red pentagram, a big pentagram." I said, "Oh, okay. Well, that was my first clue. You got a black room. Something definitely bad is going on in that room." Okay.
yeah.
And I said, "That sounds very much like witchcraft or Satanism type stuff going on." And that's what it was. So I advised that she get the house spiritually cleansed, blessed, as we call it, the whole property that way. because you do not know what was done in that room or what was done in that house and what he may be doing. Later on, you might have a lot of problems from that if you don't take care of it the right way.
Yeah. Yeah. So are you familiar with the old exchange dungeon in South
Yeah, I spent the night there, as a matter of
Oh,
fact,
did
in
you?
the old exchange building there. It has a lot of history to it. As a matter of fact, I stood in the very window that George Washington stood in to watch his parade that they gave him when he was president in Charleston. And underneath in the dungeon area, it's where they held the pirates. And they had recently found a hidden room down there when I had been there. It was a
Oh,
powder room, and they did not know it was walled up. You could still smell the powder from the 16th century, the
wow.
gunpowder. You know, there was none left in there, but I mean, the smell was still there. It was definitely very historical. And I said, I've definitely got to spend the night in this place. Okay, no doubt about it. And the tour guide said something very interesting. It was bricked up. It had bricks, it had brick archways and all that. And I'd never seen any brick archways done like that. It was very interesting. And I asked about that, and she said, "Oh, well, the same person that did Westminster Abbey laid the brickwork in this building."
Oh.
So that's how old this far back this goes. And here's the freaky thing about it, Jeremy. Throughout the different cells and the dungeons and all this, and I walked around all night, but there were statues of pirates in these cells. I swear some of them moved during the night. It was something like the Twilight Zone, okay? And I would look at it every now and then. It kind of looked like that moved to me, but anyway, it was very historical. I felt like I was back in the 16th century, definitely. And the next day from that, I did the next night, right across the street from the little short, small street, there was an old, I think it's still the only one in the United States still working as a liquor store. And it was before that was a pub. And this is where Blackbeard the pirate hung out. There were reports of pirate ghosts being seen in this liquor store. And I spent the night there. And it was a freak incident. I spent the whole night there in the basement of this building. The basement had a trap door. It's like something out of a horror movie, okay? It was a big trap door, and you had to open it up and go down the stairs to the basement. And the basement had two tunnels like in it, and the tunnels ran upon the street. I mean, you're talking 200 or 300-year-old brickwork under here. And I was just remembering from the exchange building all the way under the ground to this place building where I was in, ran the 16th century seawall that was originally in the port harbor. Pirates crossed over this, okay? I mean, this was very old. And I stood all night on that 16th century seawall in this basement. And I had some freaky stuff happen. But here's the interesting part of it all. I couldn't get anything on film. I was trying my best. I had different cameras trying my best. I could see lights during the night. And they were the only thing I could say very much like fireflies in a way. I would see these lights, but they wouldn't come on for a few minutes and go off. They would just spark every now and then. It was weird.
Yeah.
I could tell it was spiritual energy like stuff going on, but I could not get it on camera. Could not get on film. But while I was sitting there, I had the strangest experience. It felt like, and I could hear the rustle of a dress, the rustle of something like a dress, and like someone walked up to me. I could not see anything now, and I'm sitting in darkness, but there, the camera light's giving me a little light here, and just like somebody walked up and put their hand on my cheek, like I felt that, and it was very feminine feeling thing, like a woman would do. And so later on, I went and talked to the guy that owned the place. He was a very nice guy. I had to promise him I wouldn't get rid of his ghost, though. Okay, I said I won't. I'll leave him alone. There, I won't give it up. He didn't want me to do that. Because that was the big tourist draw for him. And I told him about my experience. He says, that's very strange. Let me tell you something that you didn't know. He said back in the mid 18th century, there were several murders in Charleston, very much like the Ripper murders. And they took place during the winter. And like 5 or 6 prostitutes were murdered. And they could not bury them because the ground was frozen. Back in those days, they didn't have heavy machinery and all that. And instead, they stored their bodies in that basement you sat in that night.
Oh.
light bulb moment,
Mhm.
feminine something, kind of thing. Okay, that was kind of validated what I felt. That was very strange. But you like it when you get validation on something like that. That sort of kind of tells you that what you were looking at has an explanation for it to a certain
Yeah.
extent. That was very freaky. But you run into situations like that. Now, when I later on, I investigated the pirates, which were further down on the battery. This is a little bit further down from the exchange building on the battery, which is in the harbor. That area, I had some very interesting experience out there. Now, I was talking about that. It's not that far away from that jail that's further on back into the swamp like area that's there. Um, they had where the scaffolding was for the where they hung the pirates faced the harbor. So that if you sailed in your pirate ship in the harbor, you'd see them hanging there. Okay, that was outdoor advertisement back in the day,
Yeah.
and they would take, like I said, they would take the bodies down, throw them in the swamp. They wouldn't bury them; they'd throw them in the swamp, and that is a bad thing to do because if you do not put someone to rest, that's how you supposedly make restless spirits. Okay. So I'm
Yeah.
out on the battery that night. This was several years later from the exchange building and all that. But I was in that area and I had one of those weirdest things happen. And it was during the summer. I guess it was probably like after nightfall. It got down around 85 degrees, something like that. And I'm standing out there and I see this mist form. And it was, I'm not going to say it was in the shape of somebody, but it was that size shape, human
Yeah.
size shape, maybe 6 foot, maybe 3 foot wide or something. Mist, just a column like of mist, and it was moving very slowly across this area. And some other people saw it too, but we could not get it on film because it was in the dark. If you would turn the light, lights kill everything. You have to have infrared lights on things to catch stuff like that. But we were unprepared for this, unfortunately. We didn't expect this to happen. If you could be ready for it, you could have everything ready. But anyway, I walked up to this meeting, and there were some other people saw, what the heck is that? Is that some kind of, weather thing going on here or what? What is this? And I walk up to them. Most people wouldn't walk up to it. I like to go to the things, okay? I want to get a closer look at it. Somebody said that's probably what'll get me killed one day. I want a closer look, and that'll be that's what'll do me in. And it's just very slowly moving, just like someone would be walking, but very slowly walking across this area. And I'm thinking, wow, the history of this place, the people that hung here, and all this stuff. This has got to be connected to this. I mean, that's what I'm thinking. So while I'm standing there, I put my hand in this mist, this column of
Oh.
mist, and while I'm standing there, it's slowly dissolving, like it's just moving. And I said, well, I can't, I got to put my hand in it. So I put my hand in it, and it was at least 10 degrees cooler than
Oh.
outside of it. I mean, I could immediately felt it like sticking your hand in a freezer,
Yeah.
but it wasn't
Yes.
that cold. It was cold though, but it wasn't, freezer cold, but it
Yeah.
was cold. It was at least 10 degrees. I'm going to say from where I was standing at 85, it was around 75, maybe 70. That was really freaky. And we stood there and slowly watched it dissolve. I wish I could have got that on camera. That would have been an excellent capture. But that was strange. Somebody told me later on, I saw, I'm related to this, they said that had been seen before in that same
Oh.
area. And only at night and only after midnight. But a lot of things happened along in that battery. There was like a duel out there where a man was shot and he went to one of the houses nearby there. It's a bed and breakfast now. I've always wanted to stay in it, but I've been in it, but I never stayed there as overnight or anything. But he died supposedly on the stairs after he got shot with this duel. He was in the duel and he died trying to get home, got on the stairs. He was the doctor too, by the way. That was kind of interesting that they say his ghost is heard walking still to this day, like with somebody, like a man with boots on. Back in the old day, they wore riding boots and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like walking across this wooden floor, and he gets to the stairs, and they never go up but halfway to the stairs. And the woman said that's where he died, halfway up the stairs. They never
Oh.
made it to the top. Yeah. And there was another home I went in that was supposedly had some type of a white lady apparition in it that walked along the back balcony. This house had holes in it from the Civil War. I think it was a cannonball still stuck in the wall. And the woman actually pulled the shutter back and showed it to me. I put my hand on it. There was a cannonball was still sticking in the wall from the Civil War. Just like living in a museum in that place. And she had artifacts that she had been digging in the garden out back and then dug up all kinds of stuff. They had it mounted and all that. So it was like living in a museum. And in that area of the city, you got to get permission to almost drive a nail in the wall from the historical society. Yeah. So it's really interesting. But I got that, and that was one of the houses on what's called Rainbow Road. Rainbow Road is like every house is painted a different color. It's a beautiful, beautiful city. It's called the Holy City. I call it the Holy, but it's called the Holy City because it has several different churches inside the city limits, and they are very old. Matter of fact, and I was in there one day. I'll tell you a story in a little while about that. It's a very strange story that happened to me in the cemetery there. But I was in there looking around for one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. Actually, it was buried in there from the state of South Carolina. And I did find his grave, but it was not well marked, which I thought was a shame. The Historical Society needs to do a little bit better than that because you have one little inky dinky plaque on it or something. And I think, God, this guy's signed the Declaration of Independence. My gosh, But there's a lot. Wherever you go in that city, there's a lot of history. I investigated one night. I stayed all night on what's called Rope Maker's Lane, and it's supposed to be haunted by the shadow of a dead pirate that is seen on the wall down there because he was stabbed to death in this alleyway one night.
Oh.
And you're supposed to be able to see his shadow on the wall. I did see a few shadows on the wall, but they were kind of explainable from my perspective of it. I wanted to see something a little more definite, shadow-wise, that I didn't see. But yeah, you talking about creepy. This was like something out of a definite horror movie. That place was creepy at night. And I had several people who did not want to stay down there, so I had to stay there by myself, which is okay. I've been in a lot worse situations than that over the years. But it was interesting. Yeah, definitely. Wherever you go in that city, you will find some definite history. Absolutely.
Yeah. One of the places, I don't know if it's on that street you were talking about with different colored houses, it's called the Pink House. It was originally a tavern and a brothel. It was frequented by pirates. I guess now it's, I think, an art gallery. But from what I had read, that it's very paranormally active. What do you think happens when a building gets, the function of the building gets changed? Does it affect, like, it was a brothel, now it's an art museum? Do you think that affects the hauntings or enhances?
Well, I think one of the main reasons why brothels are haunted so much is that a lot of murders took place in them, a lot of killings. Yeah, that's usually what they. And there were some ladies of the evening that probably passed in some of those places too, during the drugs or whatever the situation. So the House of Ill Repute was definitely an House of Ill Repute back in the old days. And like I say, the history of these things is what determines their haunting capability, you might say, to a certain extent. I have actually seen very strange, bizarre lights in places like that, which I think are something very much like residual spiritual energy. I've actually seen it do that. And the thing about orbs, as people call them, I can make all the orbs I want to if I go out on a rainy day or stir up dust. Those are orbs, okay? But when it comes to something that moves along with its own sort of energy source and it has a sort of intelligence to it, that's when you pay attention to it because that is something other than dust motes or water droplets, definitely. But, I have to laugh at some people say, oh, it's a different color orb and it means something, not necessarily. It means it could be dust. But when you deal with something like that is exhibiting an intelligence, and I've seen them move through a room and walk around a post or something, just move around a post like they knew that post. They didn't hit the post like a dust would. They walk around the post, go around it. That tells you something is definitely, and it's not a bug or anything like that. You rule that out. You got to look at it twice then, because it is something like residual spiritual energy. I have seen, there was one instance where I actually seen one form one time and just kind of pop like with a very audible little pop like, and that is energy definitely of some sort, whatever you're dealing with on that, Einstein theorized many years ago that all energy never goes away. It never dies. It just takes some form or another. It always remains. Maybe that includes spiritual energy. Definitely.
Yeah.
I have seen in certain instances the demonic form that way. They're sort of coming from, I call it interdimensional, is basically what it is. They're coming from like a spiritual dimension and manifesting into your spiritual dimension. They're taking a different form,
Yeah.
they're doing something. And you can see this manifesting. And here's the weird thing about it when it comes to certain paranormal entities. When they transfer from that spiritual and into that physical realm, then they can deal with you physically. And you can deal with them physically in a different way than you would in a spiritual
Yeah.
context. That's the interesting thing about it. But just say, for example, if someone takes upon themselves the dark demonic power of becoming a werewolf, they take that demonic power from the spiritual aspects of the universe and transfer it into the physical aspect, therefore becoming a werewolf, which would tear you into pieces physically, or you can kill it. When it comes to werewolves, you don't dispatch them with silver bullets. Okay, that's not even in folklore. That's more or less Hollywood kind of thing. You would
That's
dispatch
Hollywood.
them by cutting their head off with a sword. That's the main way you get rid of them. And then you get rid of vampires that way too. The stake in the vampire is just to hold him down while you cut his head off. Basically, that's the way you do that. I've done some vampire hunting and werewolf hunting in my time, but that's how you dispatch these things. You never hunt a monster without first finding out how to dispatch that monster if you should happen to run into it. You need to know that. It's very important information. The silver is known as sort of a precious metal, sort of a holy like metal, but it doesn't dispatch monsters most of the time. If you're going to get into that, it takes a more, shall we say, more of a physical approach to it than shooting something with silver. But people who are swore to have taken down werewolves, stuff like that, with silver bullets, never mention the fact that the bullet is blessed, which is what it's basically doing. You can bless any bullet and it will
Yeah.
do that. So it doesn't have to be silver. Okay. So don't run out and spend all your money on silver bullets. But mostly that's a Hollywood thing. And that's the problem when it comes to the paranormal and all this stuff, Jeremy. We've got that Hollywood filter in place on some of this stuff, and we need to take that down. That filter does not need to be there. Hollywood expands upon folklore, and I've studied folklore for many, many years. I love folklore. I'm a member of the Folklore Society of America. I love folklore. Folklore gives us indications and markers on stuff that we need to know. But Hollywood, you cannot trust that much because it's more geared to exaggerating things more so than folklore even does. That's where you come from with that. But a lot of Hollywood stuff they get out of folklore. They just screw around with it the wrong way. But that's the way that goes with that. But when it comes to monster hunting, you got to know is definitely how to dispatch your monster. The number one rule of monster hunting is the monster hunter must never become the monster. And another rule is the hunted, the hunter must never become the hunted. So you don't ever want to do that either. So those
Yeah.
are some good rules to live.
Yeah. You know, when you investigate a place, places in Charleston history, there's pirates, slavery, wars, executions. How do you distinguish between the earthbound spirits, residual hauntings, and actual like demonic activity?
Well, there are different indicators depending on what you're dealing with. Okay, well, just say, for instance, if it's residual, I'll give you an illustration of that. It could be like seeing a lantern lit out on the ramparts of a fort or something. You see it actual. And back in the old days when they lit a fire, you didn't pull out a lighter and light it. You had to strike a flint. And I've actually seen that. Actually, you could see a spark like a flint and then a light glow. And you could tell they were lighting a lantern of some sort, like a candle or something. And then soldiers would do this to walk along the ramparts of the forts and stuff like that. When you see something like that, that is residual. It's been done a million times. It's something being repeated over and over and over again. Residual does not interact with you. It
Yeah.
doesn't even notice your existence. Okay. And I've had many reports of what we call residual haunting in that way. Also, I can tell you that residual haunting can be a sound. It can be like cannon fire or gunfire from an old battlefield. that happened 200 years ago. You still hear this again. These are like memories and echoes of time that are left behind by these things. And you see all this ghost reported sightings in Gettysburg and places like that. They're usually marching or they're doing something. This is residual. Basically what you're doing is seeing back through time. But if like what happened with me in Charleston, in that pub was something come up and actually touched me, that was interaction. That's a different type of a thing going on. That's a different haunting. The full bodied apparition I saw was down a hallway. And that's kind of rare. Sometimes there will be a partial, like from the waist up or an arm or leg. You never know. A full bodied apparition is sort of the holy grail of a paranormal investigation. When I saw it, I did not realize that it was a full bodied apparition because it looked so real. I mean, I thought it was somebody. And I was at this lady's house putting my camera up down a hallway, dimly lit, but it was lit. And I was setting my camera up, and there was just me and this lady in the house, and somebody else that was with me outside. They were outside getting equipment out or whatever, and I was setting the camera up. And because this woman had reported a shadow-like movement along there, and I was setting up a laser blanket and all that, just trying to capture an image on the camera of a shadow moving along there. So I'm setting all this up. And down the very end of the hall, I see a woman come out of the room, go across the hall and into another room. And just that quick, and she was an elderly lady. I could see the floral print of her house coat. She had on a house coat, and she was just slowly shuffling along across the hall, And it was just that quick, just as quick as it took me to tell you. That's how quick it was, So I go back to the kitchen. She's in the kitchen, I think she was making coffee for everybody or something. I said, "Well, who's this other one? I thought you were in this house alone. I thought you lived here alone. Her boyfriend lived with her, but he was at work." And she said, "Yeah, why you asked that?" I said, "Well, I just saw somebody cross your hall down there." And she said, "What? What did they look like?" And I said, "Well, it was an elderly lady. She had white hair. She had on a house coat." And the woman, I say the woman, like, why is a ghost? She, she says, white hair. And I said, yeah. I said, she had on sort of like a floral print house coat. Like, she said, "Oh my God, that's my mother. That's my mother. She passed away in that room." And that was the house coat she wore.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I said, "Oh, that's very interesting," because I just saw her again. And so we figured out that's probably what was going on. Her mother or something attached very much like that was taking place in this house. We never saw it again. I set up, I waited, I wanted to see, definitely catch another side of it, but never saw it again. But wasn't like you see in the movie. Couldn't see the wall behind it. It looked like a solid person, just like you and me. I was probably maybe no more than 8 foot away from it when he did that, And I have come close to that same thing happening again in other situations, seeing things like that, but never one that full body like that. But I would like to have been closer in that situation to see what that looked like closer up like that. But that was very interesting. Absolutely.
Yeah. In your book, Beyond the Shadows, you discussed defending against dark forces. What advice would you give tour guides and paranormal investigators that are going into some of these haunted locations?
Well, one thing I do caution against, and being a demonologist and having had a lot of experience in this, unfortunately, that way, Ouija boards are not to be messed around with too much. I don't like people that think they've got to investigate with those. You're opening up a can of worms best left unopened, put it that way, because I have had thousands of cases over the years having to do with Ouija boards. I've used them for years, nothing happened. I said, "Well, you've been incredibly lucky. Somebody's looking out for you, because you never know, like I said earlier, when you open that door to the other side, what's waiting on the other side for you. You never know. You're playing Russian roulette with the spirits in some ways. I don't like to see people do that. I caution them about that, because you're opening spiritual doorways, no matter what the situation is and what may happen. But I do warn people, I'm very cautious about this too, even with cryptozoology. I mean, any kind of investigation, whether it be paranormal or that, you need to protect yourself spiritually going in and coming out of that situation. There have been many cases I've had over the years of paranormal investigators having attachments. They take their homework home with them, and you don't want to do that,
Yeah.
especially if you have little kids at home or whatever the situation is. I've had that happen many times. I've had people call me, "Oh, I did an investigation night and something followed me home." There's no reason for that to happen if you can correctly protect yourself and do it correctly to keep yourself from having that situation. There's a right way and a wrong way to do things. You don't want to waste time doing it the wrong way, which is why I wrote the book. You want to do it the right way. You want to take the right approach to it. Whatever the situation is, and like I said, you've got to look at it like a crime scene. It's like a containment of an experiment, just like you were doing a scientific experiment. You try to keep out as much outside interference as possible away from it. You try to keep that area. And when you go, I'll just give you an example. Like, say, if you were to send me into a room where there had been a haunting, I would tell you, I don't want you to tell me what happened because I don't want to predispose my mind to it. I want to, like I said, I want that crime scene to speak to me and tell me what happened there. But, that's what you don't see in the TV shows and all that. As many hours you stay alone in that room waiting for that to happen. But once you go in there, you got to look upon it as if you were performing an experiment. And you got to let that room return as much as possible to its natural state before you walked in there. Because it's been my experience, if you go in to investigate a place, spirits that are there will hide from you. You have interrupted their space. They don't like that. It's just like getting in somebody's personal space. Spirits have personal space too. Okay.
Yeah.
They're very much like that, and they don't like for you to get in it. So they will go up or down. They'll go up to hide or go down to hide. I've found them many times in attics and basements. So that's where they went to hide, just to get away from you. So you got to spend some time letting that area get back to its normal environment. And you're sitting there and you're becoming part of that environment. The same thing was if you were looking for Bigfoot out in the woods. You need to sit still. Instead of walking around, bumping around, looking for him and knocking on trees, that's not the right way to do that. You got to kind of ambush this guy, because he can hear you coming from 3 miles away. Okay. Now I'm not saying you don't go out and look for footprints and all that. Yeah, that's fine. That's part of the process. But I'm saying actually actively looking for him. You don't walk all the way through the woods all the time looking for him because you're going to scare him off. You wait somewhere that you're likely to run into him. Same thing with spirits. If you've got a place where spirits have been seen, that's where you go back to investigate again because it's a more likely possibility they're going to come back to that place. And that's the way it goes with anything like that you're investigating. But you got to let that place get back to its more normal feeling, settle back down to what it needs to be. And that way you got a sort of, a leg up in the saddle on it. You're on top of the game with that if you do that. But it's been my experience when you go into that space, you are disturbing it, whatever it may be. And, but to protect yourself against demonic spirits, you've got to be spiritually minded against this. You've got to have, I'm not going to say you got to have a pure heart, but your intentions have got to be good. And if you are investigating, let's say feeling low, you're depressed or you're sick, you don't feel good or you're tired, you don't need to be investigating. Okay. Because these spirits will take advantage of that. They'll hit you where it's low. Okay. They will do that every time. That's the way they operate. And I've had people come to me during investigations and say, Dr. Carroll, I'm sick in my stomach. I got a headache. I said, oh, you need to leave because they are attacking you. They're doing something to your system. You need to get out. I will not let people continue like that.
Yeah.
Because there's a problem developing, definitely. You don't want to encounter. Yeah. I've often told a lot of people, I've mentored a lot of groups over the years. I say, you do not want your investigation to end in the ER.
No.
It's always bad.
So this time, look, your book, The Road Unseen, deals with high strangeness. What have you encountered anything in Charleston that kind of fits that category?
Well, there have been several instances. I think there was one, we were at Patriots Point outside of Charleston where a lot of the pirate activity went on and there were a lot of smuggler stuff that went on around that area as well. There have been some lights seen over the harbor and all that. It's a place that could not be explained. And we saw some one night there that were very strange. They were moving kind of erratically, very much like some of the UFOs. I've actually seen a UFO myself pretty well close. I mean, close enough I could have hit it with a rock. But that wasn't that night. That was somewhere else. These lights were what I would term like the old pilots call Foo Fighters kind of lights. They were very erratic, very strange, red orb type lights that were seen over the harbor. That was kind of unexplainable. What the heck that was. And of course, this was back before there were drones, actually, that we have now. Like we had back in the day, the model planes that people flew. You could hear those things a mile off. But that was before drones, and that was very strange and very interesting. And of course, in that very same area, they have what's called the Seneca gun. These are like booms, and they can't explain those. So it could be some kind of atmospheric stuff going on. I've always looked a lot into these what I call earth mysteries, strange lights and stuff that are reported in some of these areas. It might be seismic activity. And, Charleston was hit once upon a time leveled by a very bad earthquake. It was almost as bad as the one that hit San Francisco, years ago, back in that day. So, it could possibly be some type of seismic activity of some sort. I don't know, but it is a mystery, nevertheless.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we had some very strange, interesting incidents in that area, definitely. But then now the UFO I'm referring to, I actually saw here in my hometown one day, which was one of these black triangular craft. And that thing was as big, almost, I would say, you would have had a hard time putting it down on a football field, that big, and
Yeah.
completely eerily silent. They flew right over my head. I'm like I said, it's really serious. I could have hit it with a rock. It was that close and completely silent and extremely fast. And it has sort of a slight glow to it. But I've had people over the years ask me, what do you think that was? I said, I don't know. I really cannot tell you 100% what the heck that is. But if we have that, if we've got something like that, we could take over the world tomorrow. No problem.
Yeah.
We could do that. I mean, that kind of technology. I feel like it was military, but I just don't know who or what military it
What?
was.
Yeah.
That's all I can say.
Any cryptids around Charleston?
There have been reports very close near there. Of course, well, not real close, but of Lizard Man I've looked into. That's in Bishopville,
Yeah.
which is sort of the low country. Yeah. There have been what's the very famous, I guess you would call a cryptid of Charleston. That area is the Gray Man of Pawleys Island, which is sort of an apparition, more of a cryptid kind of thing. But he is sort of a warning of impending disaster from hurricanes. But it's good luck to see him, supposedly, because if you see the Gray Man, your house will be spared, supposedly, from hurricanes. I think the last recent sighting of him was just a few months back when I think there was that last hurricane that we had off the coast. But they say it's good luck if you see him. So you definitely would want to see the Gray Man, supposedly. He has a tragic history. He supposedly died in some kind of a love triangle thing that went on there or something, and he didn't make it back or whatever the situation was. This ghost haunts the beach of Pawleys Island, supposedly, and it comes out only during storms that he's seen. But now, close by in Bishopville, I was looking for, I went on a hunt for the Lizard Man, who has supposedly torn up a few automobiles, has chased some people. And a young man one night supposedly saw him when he was fixing a flat tire on the side of the road. And that's a very swampy place. There's anything could be out there in that swamp. Definitely, it was a scary looking place. And actually, I talked to someone down there in the know. I can't reveal exactly who he was, but he's pretty well up in the government down there. And I picked up some very strange radiation readings out there in that swampy area over that, and I told him about it. He said, "Well, let me tell you," he said, "they've dumped who knows what kind of chemicals out there. God only knows what could be out there." So that's interesting too. So I would definitely like to go back and look some more for the Lizard Man.
Yeah.
Maybe he'll show up. Yeah.
So, for the common historian audience, we're full of history buffs, and a lot of them love the paranormal, but we do have some that are skeptical about the paranormal. But they might be fascinated with Charleston's pirate history and dark history. What would you say could fill the gap there for someone that's kind of they're They like the kind of dark history, but they're not really into the paranormal.
Well, definitely. I mean, there's so much history there. I love cemeteries. Okay, not because of the paranormal factor, but
Yeah.
a cemetery, if you look at it the right way, is like opening a history book. So some of the songs will tell you about different battles and things. So it's very interesting to me. I love cemeteries, and that's the historian part of me. I like them. And they're quiet places to go and contemplate history and all that. It's amazing. And that is some of the most historical cemeteries I have ever been in or in that city. This beautiful cemetery is very gothic looking too. I think some of the stones go back to the early mid 16th century in some of those areas and all that. So it's just going way back. I had a friend in England, when we talk about history in this country, we can only go back to like the 16th century. When you talk about history in England, you go like
Way
centuries.
back. Way back.
A lot
Yeah.
of a lot more things than you do here. But we do have a lot of things I've studied over the years, like a lot of the mound builders that were here. There were people here before the Native Americans were. We don't even know about them. So there's a lot of history, even here in this younger country. That people can look into. But yeah, there's a lot of mysteries out there. I've always been fascinated by mysteries. Like I said, Earth mysteries, other types of mysteries. I love a good mystery. I love to look at these things to see, like the Brown Mountain lights and the Marfa lights in Texas, all these strange Earth lights that people report and other things. That's fascinating stuff. And a lot of this, like I said, was definitely tied to history and that side of history that you don't get taught about, that you don't read about in the history books. To me, that's the fascinating. They're leaving the juiciest parts out. That's the interesting thing about it. The history and the on the background. And here's what I like too about history. It is like, unfortunately, probably for many, many years, be the only real time machines that we have are the old photographs and the old accounts and the records and the stories. As a writer myself, I've often said that no story, no matter what it is, should ever be lost to
Yeah.
history. And we've lost a lot of history over the years, unfortunately. When somebody dies, look how much history dies with that person. And it's been like, even my father was in World War II, and people like that who have gone on, I would love to go back and ask them so many questions now that I can't.
Yeah.
And that's the sad part about history. But history is very important. We are our history, and our history is us. And you don't want to lose that identity of yourself. You become less human in many ways. So history is very important. It's our makeup, our very makeup to it. And that's why these records and these stories, podcasts, all these things need to be preserved for history, for posterity. Because this is history. And for many, many years, and I know, I've studied like my own people that I come from, the Celtics, the Irish, and the Scots, and all that. They preserved their history with stories down through the centuries. Instead of books, it was stories. How very important storytellers were once upon a time. They were the true historians of our world, and they had a very important place and still do. But now we have so many different ways we can record history. I've spent over the years doing a lot of my research and all that. How many long, lonely hours I spent in libraries and reference rooms looking up stuff. You couldn't take them home with you. You had to read it there. And now you have the library of the world at your fingertips. How amazing that is. And even looking up historical records and all that. You have to go back and look in the old newspapers and all that stuff. People don't realize what a treasure you have in the internet. It's amazing what is past. And I have to wonder, although you and I may not be here to see it, 100 years from now, what kind of history reserves they will have, and what kind of things, and who may be watching this podcast 1,000 years from now.
Oh, yeah.
That's interesting to think about too. So
is.
not only is history a part of where we've been, but it also is in a strange way a part of where we're going.
Yes.
And
it's a big reason that I started my YouTube channel and like to do these interviews. It's preserving history. I love the stories, and that's why I do what I do on this podcast. I do have a couple more questions and we'll be wrapping up. I know you mentioned that you're working on a new book. Is there any other new projects on the horizon?
Yeah, that new book I'm working on is called Paracryptidology. And the reason I named it that is because paranormal investigation and cryptozoology are now together. They have merged into one
Right.
thing. And some people don't like that, and some do. I think it's okay as long as it's looked at the right way. It is now merged. Once upon a time, we were looking for unknown species. Now, we talk about werewolves or whatever the, cryptid supposedly is. Cryptid is a broad umbrella now that covers a lot of stuff. But that's why I decided to name it paracryptidology, hunting monsters and things of nightmare. You not only hunt monsters out in the deep, dark woods or in the buildings and stuff, but you hunt them through history too. You hunt them through records, you hunt them through books, you hunt them in different ways through the research. That's why I've always tagged myself as an investigative researcher. It's one thing to just sit around and read something. It's another thing to investigate it and go through the rabbit holes that you need to. And you need to go deep into those rabbit holes sometimes. And I have spent many hours in those rabbit holes, definitely. There are a lot of them. And when you get down there, here's the bad news I tell people. When you get down the rabbit hole, you find out, my gosh, there's a great big network of them down here that you got to get into. That's the interesting part, too. But that's fascinating, too. That one rabbit hole leads to another and another and on and on. You never finish. But that is investigative research. That's what I like. That's where you get down to the brass tacks and you look at it from every angle. Any kind of investigation, whether it be paranormal or whatever, is like holding a diamond up to the light. You've got to look and turn it to see all the different facets that
Yeah.
make that diamond what it is. And that's the way it goes with investigative research. You got to look at it from all different angles. To me, that's what makes it fascinating and very interesting. I had somebody ask me I've been involved in this now for well over half a century. Am I ever going to retire? I said, ain't no way. It's just too darn fascinating. I got to stay with it to the end. To me, that makes it very interesting, especially from not only the historical part, but the folklore and history together. Definitely. There's a big tie with that. All of these different aspects of it make it that more interesting to me. And I've been interested in a lot of other fields, astronomy, archaeology. I love that. All these things, like I said, are connected in that strange way. This connectedness makes life that much more interesting, no matter which way you look at it. Yeah, definitely.
So, kind of a last question. Where can people find you if they want to learn more about what you're up to and your work?
Okay, well, now my books are available on Barnes and Noble and Amazon. You just look up the author, Dennis W. Carroll. I had to put that W in there. There's another Dennis Carroll. He plays football, and I don't. But you can look it up that way. And also, you can look it up via my website, which is denniswcarroll.com, or you can email me. I have a consultation service, a paranormal consultation. I have a lot of people call me and ask me demonology questions or whatever the situation. I counsel people on their paranormal problems. You can reach me through the website or at denniswcarroll@gmail.com. I have several podcasts that I do, which can be found on my podcast channel, which is called Hunting the Shadows YouTube podcast channel and agency. And that can be found on YouTube. Just look up Hunting the Shadows, Dennis Carroll. And my books, the book I'm working on right now, hopefully we'll have it done maybe by the end of the year. I'm trying to reach there. We'll see. But when it is, it will be on Amazon as well.
Okay. Well, Dennis, it's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you for sharing your knowledge about Charleston haunted history and everything else that you shared with us tonight. For anyone watching, if you want to learn more about Dennis's work, check out his website at denniswcarroll.com. And you can also find his books on Barnes and Noble or Amazon. And I also will put all the links in the description below as well. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Charleston paranormal history, do me a favor and hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below. And remember, history never truly dies. It just finds new ways to haunt us. Until next Saturday, keep digging into the darkness.